When magic turns to ash and blood becomes a verdict, the only spark of life remains in the hands of an enemy. Will this night be a beginning, or the beginning of the end? This story is unfolding right now. The silence of the castle was not peaceful. It was a living, suffocating thing. It pressed against the stone walls of Hogwarts, heavy with the weight of 1,000 held breaths. Outside, the night sky was an endless bruise of purple and black, the protective enchantments shimmering like a fever dream above the turrets. Inside, the air tasted of ozone, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of terror. Hermione Granger walked through the shadows of the third-floor corridor, her footsteps deliberately light, though the echo seemed to boom in her own ears like a drumbeat. She needed to be away, just for a moment, just for a heartbeat. Down in the Great Hall, the Order was organizing. The Weasleys were huddled in a tight knot of red hair and grim faces. And Harry was staring at the map with a look that made Hermione's chest ache with a physical, sharp pain. Everyone looked at her with hope. They looked at her as if she were a pillar of unshakable marble, the brightest witch of her age, the girl who always had a plan, a spell, a solution. But she was 18 years old, and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She tucked her hands into the pockets of her denim jacket, her fingers curling around the familiar, rough wood of her wand. The castle felt different tonight. It wasn't the warm, welcoming home of her childhood. It felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The portraits were empty, their inhabitants having fled to safer canvases, leaving behind only painted backdrops of dark landscapes and empty chairs. The torches burned low, casting long skeletal shadows that danced and twisted on the floor, mimicking the monsters she knew were waiting just outside the gates. She didn't know where she was going until she stopped in front of a heavy oak door near the library annex. An old arithmancy classroom, unused for years. It was out of the way, forgotten by the patrols, forgotten by the narrative of the war. She pushed the door open. It groaned, a sound of protest that scraped against her nerves. The room was bathed in a spectral blue light filtering through the tall arched windows. Dust motes danced in the moonbeams, swirling in slow, chaotic patterns. Rows of desks stood covered in white sheets, looking like huddled ghosts in the gloom. The air here was colder, stagnant, smelling of old ink and dry parchment. Hermione exhaled, a shaky sound that fogged in the chill air. She leaned back against the closed door, closing her eyes, trying to force her heart to slow its frantic rhythm. Inhale, exhale, just survive until dawn. Then she heard it, a sharp intake of breath, a ragged, wet sound, like something tearing. Hermione's eyes snapped open. Her wand was in her hand before her mind had even registered the threat, the movement born of a year spent on the run, sleeping on forest floors with one eye open. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear spiking in her veins. Silence answered her, but not a true silence. It was the silence of a held breath. She stepped forward, her wand tip glowing with a faint, threatening hum. She moved past the first row of shrouded desks, her senses dialed to the highest frequency. The sound came again, a stifled choke, a desperate attempt to suppress a cough or a sob. It was coming from the far corner, nestled in the shadows of a large, dust-covered cabinet. Hermione cast a silent lumos. The tip of her wand ignited, casting a harsh white glare into the darkness. The figure in the corner flinched violently, recoiling as if struck physically by the light. It was Draco Malfoy. For a second, the world tilted on its axis. Hermione's mind struggled to reconcile the image before her with the reality of the war. Draco Malfoy, the Death Eater, the boy who had let the wolves into the castle, the architect of Dumbledore's fall. But he didn't look like a villain. He didn't even look like a soldier. He was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the wood of the cabinet, knees drawn up to his chest. His expensive black suit was rumpled, covered in grey dust. His tie was loosened, hanging askew like a broken noose around his neck. But it was his face that froze the hex on Hermione's tongue. He was pale, translucent in the wand light, his skin the colour of old parchment. Deep purple bruises circled his eyes, which were blown wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked hollowed out, carved away, as if someone had reached inside him and scraped out everything that made him Draco Malfoy, leaving only a trembling shell. "Granger," he gasped. The name wasn't a sneer. It was a breathless, exhaled curse, a recognition of doom. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding uselessly on the stone floor, trying to put more distance between them, though there was nowhere left to go. His hand fumbled at his belt, searching for his wand, but his fingers were shaking so violently that he couldn't grip the hawthorn wood. It clattered to the floor, rolling away from him, stopping just inches from Hermione's boot. They both stared at the wand. Hermione looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no occlumency shields there tonight, no arrogant mask, just raw, naked terror. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in shallow, rapid jerks that seemed painful to watch. "Do it," he wheezed, his voice cracking. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, exposing the line of his throat. "Just do it." Hermione's grip on her wand tightened. This was the enemy. This was the boy who had watched her be tortured on his drawing room floor. This was the boy who had called her a mudblood since she was 12. Logic dictated she should stun him, bind him, and drag him to the Order. He was a liability. He was dangerous. But looking at him now, huddled in the dust, waiting for the killing curse, she felt a surge of nausea. He wasn't fighting. He had surrendered before the battle had even begun. "I'm not going to kill you, Malfoy," she said, her voice sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. Draco's eyes opened, grey, stormy, and confused. He looked at her as if she had spoken in a language he didn't understand. He looked at his wand near her foot, then back at her face. The suspicion in his eyes was instant, a reflex honed by fear. "Why?" he spat. The word lacked venom. It was just brittle. "Saving your energy for the Dark Lord? Or do you want to drag me out there and let Weasley do it?" "I'm not like you," Hermione said, the words slipping out sharper than she intended. She kicked his wand. It skittered across the floor, back toward him. "Pick it up." Draco stared at the wand, then at her. He didn't move. He looked paralyzed. His breathing was getting worse, coming in short, strangled gasps. He brought a trembling hand to his chest, clawing at his shirt as if his heart were trying to escape his ribcage. "I said, pick it up," Hermione commanded, stepping closer. The healer in her, the part of her that had spent months patching up Ron's splinched arm and Harry's bites, recognized the signs. It wasn't a trap. It was a full-blown panic attack. He was drowning in air. "I can't, he choked out. The arrogance was completely gone, dissolved into desperation. I can't breathe. Hermione lowered her wand, though she didn't extinguish the light. The animosity that had defined their relationship for 7 years stood between them like a physical wall, but seeing him disintegrate like this chipped away at the mortar. You're having a panic attack, she stated, her tone clinical, trying to detach herself from the person she was speaking to. You need to slow your breathing. Malfoy, look at me. He shook his head, burying his face in his knees, his hands gripping his hair. Go away. Leave me alone. If I leave you, the next person to walk through that door might not be so hesitant to hex you, she snapped. Look at me. She didn't know why she was doing this. Perhaps it was because tonight, death felt too close to everyone. Perhaps it was because seeing her tormentor reduced to a weeping child made the war feel even more senseless. Draco looked up. His face was wet. Tears he didn't seem to realize he was shedding streaked through the dust on his cheeks. Breathe with me, Hermione ordered. She took a deliberate, exaggerated breath. In. Hold it. Out. Draco stared at her with a mixture of hatred and bewilderment. He looked like a trapped animal debating whether to bite the hand or lick it. But the desperation for air won. He tried to mimic her. He sucked in a breath, held it for a millisecond, and choked it out. Again, she said, softer this time. She took a step closer. The distance between them was now only a few feet. She could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sourness of sweat. In. 1, 2, 3, out. He followed her rhythm, his eyes locked onto hers, anchoring himself to her calm. For a moment, the war outside ceased to exist. There were no Death Eaters, no Order of the Phoenix, just 2 students in a dusty classroom, breathing in sync. Slowly, the frantic heaving of his chest subsided. His hands dropped from his hair to the floor, resting palms down on the cold stone. He slumped against the cabinet, completely drained, his head tipping back to rest against the wood. He closed his eyes, his eyelashes dark against his pale skin. Hermione stood over him, her wand still illuminating the scene. She should leave. She should go back to Ron and Harry. They would be wondering where she was. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. "What are you doing here, Malfoy?" she asked quietly. "Why aren't you with them?" Draco didn't open his eyes. A bitter, humorless smile ghosted his lips. "With them? You think they want me? I'm a failure, Granger. I couldn't kill Dumbledore. I can't find Potter. I can't do anything." He opened his eyes then, and the bleakness in them hit Hermione like a physical blow. "I'm just waiting for it to be over." "The battle hasn't even started," she said. "The battle was lost a long time ago," he murmured. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze tracing the scar on her neck, the dirt on her cheek, the fierce determination that never seemed to leave her eyes. "You're a fool for staying. You're all going to die tonight." "We're going to fight," Hermione corrected him, her chin lifting. "That's the difference." "Is it?" Draco asked softly. He reached out, his fingers brushing the handle of his wand, but he didn't pick it up. Or is it just a different way to die? Hermione opened her mouth to retort, to quote Dumbledore, to defend the cause, but the words died in her throat, because in the dim light she saw the tremor return to his hands. She saw the sheer, crushing loneliness radiating off him. He wasn't a monster in this moment. He was just a boy who had been given an impossible choice and had broken under the weight of it. Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the classroom rattled. Footsteps. Heavy, clunky boots stomping down the corridor. Voices. Rough, jeering, unmistakably snatchers, or worse. "Smell that?" A voice growled from the other side of the door. "Fresh meat." Hermione froze. The light from her wand vanished instantly as she whispered, "Nox!" The room plunged into darkness. Draco's eyes were wide, visible only by the faint moonlight. The panic was back, instant and electric. He scrambled to his feet, but his legs were weak. He stumbled. Hermione didn't think. She moved on instinct. She surged forward, grabbing the lapel of his expensive robes, and hauled him into the narrow gap between the large cabinet and the stone wall. "Quiet," she hissed, her voice a barely audible thread of sound right against his ear. She pressed him back into the shadows, shielding his body with hers, her wand raised toward the gap, pointing at the classroom door. Draco stiffened, his body rigid against hers. He was taller than her, but right now he felt small. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, beating so hard it felt like it was echoing through her own chest. The door handle turned with a screech. A beam of light from the corridor sliced through the room, sweeping over the shrouded desks. Hermione held her breath. She felt Draco flinch, his breath hitching in his throat. Without thinking, she reached back with her free hand and clamped it over his mouth, silencing him. His skin was ice cold. His lips trembled against her palm. They stood there, pressed together in the suffocating dark, enemies forced into the intimacy of survival. The beam of light swept closer, inches from their hiding spot. If the snatchers came in, if they checked the corners. Draco's hands came up, hovering uncertainly, then gripping her waist, not to push her away, but to steady himself. His grip was tight, desperate. For the first time, Hermione wasn't the mudblood. He wasn't the Death Eater. They were just two heartbeats in the dark, praying the monster wouldn't find them. The footsteps paused at the threshold. The light lingered on the cabinet. Hermione stared into the darkness, her eyes wide, her hand pressing harder against Draco's mouth, feeling the warm puff of his terrified breath against her skin. "Don't come in," she pleaded silently to the universe. "Don't come in." The beam of light from the corridor lingered on the dust-caked wood of the cabinet for a lifetime. It sliced through the darkness, a hungry, searching eye that threatened to strip away the thin veil of their sanctuary. Hermione felt the rough wool of Draco's suit against her chest, the frantic, rhythmic thud of his heart hammering against her own ribs. Her hand was still clamped over his mouth, her palm catching the heat of his ragged breaths. Underneath her fingers, she felt his jaw muscle twitch. He was rigid, a statue of marble and fear, his fingers digging into the fabric of her jacket at her waist. The silence in the room was so absolute that the sound of the snatcher's heavy breathing in the doorway seemed to fill the entire universe. "Empty," a gravelly voice grunted. "Just more dust and ghosts. Let's check the astronomy tower. That's where the birds like to roost." The light flickered, then withdrew. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges as it was pulled shut, and the sound of receding footsteps echoed down the stone corridor until it was swallowed by the vast, hollow silence of the castle. Hermione didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was locked in a state of high-alert paralysis, her heart still racing at a tempo that made her lightheaded. She was acutely aware of the warmth of Draco's body, The way his height forced her to tilt her head back slightly, and the strange, terrifying intimacy of holding his life and her own in the palm of her hand. Slowly, she pulled her hand away from his face. Her skin felt tingly where it had touched his. Draco let out a long, shuddering exhale, his forehead dropping forward to rest against her shoulder. He didn't pull away. For several seconds, he simply leaned into her, his strength entirely spent. The scent of him, green apples, expensive parchment, and the cold, sharp tang of winter air swirled around her, a sharp contrast to the smell of damp stone and decay. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely a vibration. Draco flinched as if the sound of her voice were a physical blow. He shoved himself back, his hands releasing her waist so abruptly it felt like a rejection. He stumbled out from behind the cabinet, his boots scuffing the floor as he sought the center of the room, putting distance between them as if the air she breathed were toxic. "I didn't ask for your help, Granger," he snapped. His voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of his own humiliation. He turned his back to her, his shoulders hunched, his hands fumbling to straighten his tie with jerky, uncoordinated movements. Hermione stepped out of the shadows, her wand tip glowing with a low, soft lumos again. The light caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone and the silver-blonde mess of his hair. "You didn't have to ask. You were going to get yourself killed." "Maybe that was the point," he roared, spinning around. The suddenness of his movement made her flinch. His eyes were wild, rimmed with a frantic, desperate red. "Maybe I'm tired of hiding in corners like a rat. Maybe I'm tired of waiting for him to decide if I'm worth the dirt on his boots." He began to pace the narrow aisle between the desks, his movements predatory and agitated. "You think you're so righteous. You and Potter and the pathetic weasel, playing the heroes. You have a choice. You get to die for something noble. I just get to die for a madman who hates me almost as much as he hates you." "You had a choice, Draco," Hermione said, using his name for the first time. It felt heavy and strange on her tongue, like a secret she wasn't supposed to know. "You had a whole year. You could have come to Dumbledore. You could have asked for protection." Draco stopped pacing. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Protection? From him? There is no place on this earth where he cannot reach. My mother would be dead before I could even finish the sentence. You don't understand. You with your principles and your books. You don't know what it's like to have your soul carved out of you piece by piece until there's nothing left but a mark." With a snarl of self-loathing, he ripped back the sleeve of his left arm. In the pale light of her wand, the dark mark looked like a fresh bruise against his porcelain skin. The snake writhed sluggishly, a living parasite etched in ink. Hermione gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had seen it before, at the manor. But here, in the quiet of a classroom where they had once studied stars and numbers, it looked infinitely more grotesque. Draco saw the look of horror on her face, and his expression hardened into a mask of pure spite. "Repulsed, Granger. Good. You should be. It's what I am. It's all I'll ever be." "It's not all you are," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Don't," he hissed, backing away until he hit a desk. "Don't look at me with pity. I'd rather you cursed me. I'd rather you hated me the way you did when we were kids. At least that was honest." "I don't pity you," Hermione said, and to her surprise she realized it was true. I'm angry at you. I'm furious that you let them turn you into this, but I don't hate you. Not tonight." She reached out, her fingers hovering near his arm. Draco froze, his breath catching. He watched her hand with the intensity of a man watching a fuse burn. She didn't touch the mark. Instead, she pushed back the sleeve of her own jacket, exposing her inner forearm. The word "mud blood" was carved into her skin in Bellatrix's jagged, frantic handwriting. The scars were raised, a pale, ugly white against her skin, a permanent testament to the night at Malfoy Manor. Draco's eyes went wide. He stared at the word, his entire body beginning to tremble again. The silence between them shifted, turning from hostile to something agonizingly heavy. The air felt thick, charged with the ghosts of their shared trauma. "I carry your family's legacy on my skin," she said, her voice trembling. "And you carry theirs on yours. We are both branded, Draco. We are both casualties of a war we didn't start." Draco reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered just millimeters above her scar. He didn't touch her. It was as if he were afraid he would shatter her or burn himself, but the heat radiating from his hand was palpable. "I watched," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I stood there, and I watched her do it. I can still hear you screaming. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it." He looked up at her, and the mask was gone entirely. The grey of his eyes was flooded with a profound, aching guilt. "I'm sorry," he breathed. The words were so quiet she almost missed them, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The emotional seesaw tipped violently. The repulsion she had felt for years, the fear that had defined her night, evaporated, replaced by a devastating surge of empathy. She saw him then, not as a Death Eater, but as a boy who had been forced to watch horrors beyond his comprehension, trapped in a gilded cage of his own bloodline. "Draco," she breathed, taking a step closer. The proximity was dangerous. The tension in the room was no longer just about the war outside. It was about the two of them, the magnetic pull of two broken things finding a temporary alignment. But then the castle shook. A dull roar echoed from the grounds, followed by the sound of masonry crumbling somewhere in the distance. The first wards had fallen. The sky outside the window flared with a brilliant, sickly green light. The reality of the world rushed back in, cold and unforgiving. Draco flinched, pulling his arm back and shoving his sleeve down to hide the mark. The vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced by a frantic, jagged coldness. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. "The dark is coming, Granger. You should go back to your heroes. Go and play your part in the massacre." "Come with me," she urged, grabbing his hand. His skin was like ice. "Draco, come to the Great Hall. We can protect you." He wrenched his hand away, his expression twisting into a sneer of pure defensive malice. "Protect me? Like you protected Dumbledore? Like you're protecting this school? Look at you. You're shaking. You're terrified. You can't even save yourself, let alone a Malfoy." "Stop it," she cried, frustrated by the sudden wall he had built between them. "Stop pretending you don't care." "I don't care about anything but surviving," he yelled back, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And staying with you is a death sentence. Get out. Go before I turn you in myself." He turned his back on her, his hands gripping the edge of a desk so hard his knuckles turned white. The warmth that had briefly flickered between them was extinguished, replaced by a biting chill. Hermione stood in the centre of the room, her heart aching with a strange, hollow disappointment. She looked at his back, at the sharp line of his shoulders, and felt the immense chasm between them yawn open once more. "Fine," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Survive then, Draco. Survive in the dark. See if it's enough." She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps heavy. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling. She expected him to say something, to stop her, to take back the vitriol. But there was only silence. She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The air was colder here, filled with the smell of smoke. She took 3 steps away from the classroom before she heard it, a muffled, crashing sound from inside, followed by the unmistakable sound of Draco Malfoy falling to his knees, his composure finally, utterly breaking. She stopped. She closed her eyes, the war raging outside and the war raging inside her head, colliding in a chaotic storm. "I need to go," she told herself. "I need to find Harry." But she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. The sound of Draco's collapse echoed through the heavy wood of the door, a dull thud that seemed to vibrate against Hermione's spine. She stood in the darkened corridor, her hand still hovering in the empty air where the door handle had been. Every instinct she possessed, every logical fibre of her being, told her to run. The castle was screaming. In the distance, the first rhythmic booms of giants hitting the boundary enchantments shook the floorboards. She should be with her friends. She should be a soldier. But the sound of that collapse, the sound of a man who had finally run out of floor to stand on, held her in place. She turned back. The classroom was darker now, the moonlight obscured by a passing cloud of thick, magical smoke from the grounds. She pushed the door open just a crack. Draco was on his knees in the centre of the aisle, his forehead pressed against the edge of a dusty desk. His breath was coming in jagged, rhythmic hitches. He wasn't crying, not yet, but he was vibrating with a tension so high it looked like it might snap his bones. Hermione entered the room and closed the door softly behind her. The click of the latch made him flinch, but he didn't look up. "I told you to leave," he choked out, his voice muffled by the wood. "Go away, Granger. Be the hero. Leave me to rot." "I can't," she said, her voice small but steady. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the stone. "Because you're not rotting yet, and because I know you don't want to be alone." "You know nothing," he spat, finally lifting his head. The sight of him was devastating. The silver blonde hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his eyes were hollowed out craters of misery. "You think, because we shared a few breaths in the dark, that you understand me? You think you can fix this with a sympathetic look and a clever spell?" "I don't think I can fix anything," Hermione countered, stopping a few feet away. "But I know that you're terrified, and I know that the Malfoy you're trying so hard to be is a lie. It's a mask that's suffocating you." Draco stood up abruptly, his movements clumsy. He loomed over her, trying to regain the height of his arrogance, but his hands were still clawing at the air. "It's not a mask. It's my life. I am a Death Eater. I have the brand. I have the blood. I have the sins." He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Do you know what I've done this year? The things I've had to watch? The things I've had to do just to keep my mother breathing?" "I know you couldn't kill Dumbledore," she whispered, refusing to flinch. I know your heart wasn't in it, Draco. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter to him, he roared, gesturing wildly toward the windows. It won't matter when the walls come down. I'm a dead man walking, Hermione. Whether your side wins or his, I'm finished. There is no world for me tomorrow. The use of her first name hit her like a physical weight. It was the first time it hadn't been a slur or a clinical observation. It was a plea. The seesaw swung back toward him. The anger she had felt at his previous coldness dissolved into a painful, suffocating warmth. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and did something she had never imagined. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Draco froze. He looked down at her hand as if it were a strange alien creature. He didn't pull away. Under her palm, his heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating with a terrifying speed. "There is a world," she said, her voice cracking. "If you fight for it. Not for him, and not even for us. For yourself." For a moment, the tension changed. It wasn't the tension of two enemies, but the electric, terrifying pull of two people who were the only real things left in a world falling apart. Draco's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. His hand rose, hovering near her face, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. The touch was so light, it was almost a hallucination, but it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fire through her veins. Then the floor groaned. A massive explosion from the great hall shook the castle, throwing them both off balance. A vase on a nearby desk shattered, the shards of porcelain spraying across the floor. The spell was broken. Draco's face hardened instantly. He snatched his hand back, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, vicious suspicion. "Is this a distraction, Granger? Are you trying to keep me here so I can't join the fight? Is this Potter's plan? Use the clever girl to seduce the traitor?" Hermione's face went pale. The whiplash of his change in mood was sickening. "How can you even think that?" "Because it's what I would do," he yelled, the bitterness returning in a tidal wave. "Because everything is a move, everything is a play. You don't care about me. You care about the information I have. You care about the redemption you can put in your little school journals." "I'm here because I'm human," she shouted back, tears finally spilling over. "I'm here because I don't want to see you die. Why is that so hard for you to believe?" "Because no one has ever looked at me and seen anything worth saving." His voice broke on the last word, and he turned away, his hands flat on a desk as he fought for control. "Especially not someone like you." "Someone like me," she repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You mean a mudblood?" Draco flinched as if she'd slapped him. He didn't turn around, but his head bowed. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. It's the wall between us, isn't it? Even now, with death at the door, you can't get over the fact that I'm less than you." "You're not less," he whispered, so quietly it was almost lost to the wind howling outside. "You're more. That's the problem. You're everything I was told to hate, and you're everything I'll never be. You're brave, and you're good, and you're whole, and I'm just pieces of a person." The honesty of the admission was more intimate than the touch had been. Hermione felt her heart ache for him, a deep, hollow longing to pull those pieces back together. But the cold had settled in again. Draco straightened his posture, his mask sliding back into place, though it was cracked and peeling. "The battle has started," he said. his voice now flat and devoid of emotion. "You need to go. If you're found here with me, they'll think you're a traitor. And if they find me here with you, they won't bother with a trial. Draco, please, go!" he barked, his eyes flashing with a final desperate spark of his old fire. "Run to your golden boy. Save the world, Hermione. Leave the cowards to the dark." He walked to the far end of the room, merging with the shadows until he was nothing more than a silhouette against the flickering orange light of the fires starting outside. Hermione stood in the center of the room, her hand still feeling the ghost of his heartbeat. She felt the urge to chase him, to scream at him, to kiss him, until he remembered how to be human. But the logic of the war was screaming louder. The castle was under siege. She turned toward the door, her movement slow and heavy. Every step away from him felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't yet name. She reached the door and paused, her hand on the cold iron. "Don't die," she said into the darkness. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind and the distant rhythmic thud of the end of the world. She stepped out into the corridor, the air now thick with the smell of burning wood and ancient magic. She began to run toward the great hall, her mind a chaotic blur of Harry, Ron, and the boy she had left in the dust. She had reached the end of the corridor when she heard it, a low, melodic hum. Not an explosion, but a spell, a protection charm. She looked back and saw a faint silver light glowing from under the classroom door. He was still there. He was hiding, but he was alive. For now. "I need to know what happens when the first wall falls," Hermione thought as she dived behind a suit of armor to avoid a falling chandelier. "I need to know if he'll stay in the dark, or if the light I saw in his eyes was real." The battle for Hogwarts had begun, but for Hermione Granger, the real war was for the soul of the boy who had just called her by her name. The world outside the classroom exploded into a cacophony of screams and splintering stone. The first wave of the assault had breached the outer courtyard, and the vibration of the impact travelled through the floorboards, rattling the loose inkwells on the desks. Hermione didn't run. Not yet. She stood in the corridor, her heart a frantic pendulum swinging between duty and a magnetic, irrational pull toward the boy behind the oak door. The silver light she had seen flickering from under the door frame, the protection charm, faded as quickly as it had appeared. It was followed by a silence so heavy it felt more dangerous than the explosions. She turned back. Logic was screaming at her, calling her a fool, reminding her of the Horcruxes and the prophecy and the people dying downstairs. But there was a different kind of death happening in this room, a slow-motion soul death that she couldn't turn her back on. When she pushed the door open this time, the room was filled with the smell of scorched ozone. Draco hadn't moved to the shadows. He had collapsed again, but this time he wasn't on his knees. He was slumped against the far wall, his head lolling against the stone, his eyes half closed. The protection charm hadn't been for the room. It had been a desperate, botched attempt at a shield charm that had backfired in his weakened state. "Draco!" she cried, discarding caution. She ran to him, the hem of her robes catching on the corner of a desk. She dropped to her knees beside him. His face was a terrifying shade of grey, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, staining the white of his collar. He had pushed himself too far. The months of starvation, the lack of sleep, and the sheer psychological pressure of being Voldemort's unwilling executioner had finally broken his physical tether. "Leave! Go!" he wheezed, his hand feebly trying to push her away. His fingers brushed her arm, and he flinched as if burned. "Not safe." "Be quiet," Hermione commanded, her voice thick with a mixture of terror and tenderness. She pulled a small beaded bag from her pocket, the one that held their entire lives, and began rummaging through it. Her fingers found a cold glass vial. "You've had a magical collapse. Your core is exhausted." She uncorked the vial of calming draught, the scent of lavender and chamomile momentarily cutting through the smell of smoke. "Drink this. It's not a pepper-up, but it will stabilize the tremors." Draco's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with a hazy, bewildered intensity. "Why?" he whispered. It was the same question as before, but the venom was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability. "I let her. I watched her. I'm a monster, Granger. Let the monster die." "You're not a monster," she said, her voice cracking. She slipped her hand behind his neck to support his head. His skin was clammy, his hair damp with sweat. "Monsters don't feel guilt. Monsters don't have panic attacks in empty classrooms because they're afraid of the dark. You're just a boy who was never given a chance to be anything else." She pressed the vial to his lips. For a second, he resisted, his jaw tightening in a final vestige of Malfoy pride. Then, his eyes met hers, brown meeting grey in a collision of shared exhaustion, and he gave in. He drank the potion, his throat working as he swallowed. As the draught took hold, his breathing slowed. The frantic rattling in his chest subsided into a steady, heavy rhythm. His head remained heavy in her hand, his silver blonde hair spilling over her fingers. This was the non-verbal intimacy she had spent years fearing. The weight of him, the reality of his heartbeat, the sheer humanity of the person she was supposed to loathe. The seesaw tipped again. The repulsion was a distant memory. The warmth was now a steady, glowing coal in her chest. She found herself smoothing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her touch lingering longer than was strictly necessary for a healer. Draco's hand reached up, his fingers trembling as they closed around her wrist. He didn't pull her hand away. He held it there, his thumb tracing the pulse point in her arm. "I can't go back," he whispered, his voice clearer now, though filled with a profound sorrow. "If I go out there, I have to choose. My mother, his eyes. He'll know, Hermione. He'll look at me and he'll see you. He'll see that I didn't." "Then don't go back," she said, her heart leaping at the way he said her name. "Stay here. Hide. Until it's over." "And if your side loses?" he asked, a bitter shadow crossing his face. "If Potter falls? He'll hunt me down for the cowardice of not being on the front lines. There is no after for me." "Then we'll find one," she promised, the words impulsive and dangerous. She felt him stiffen. The trust she was offering was a bridge made of glass, and they were both heavy with the baggage of their pasts. Draco looked at her, his gaze searching her face for a lie, for a trick, for anything that would justify his hatred. "You're a terrible liar, Granger," he murmured, but his grip on her wrist tightened. "You can't save everyone. You can't even save yourself from your own heart." "Maybe I don't want to be saved from it," she whispered. The air between them changed. The tension was no longer about the war or the blood or the scars. It was the tension of the precipice. The silence of the room was filled with the unspoken words of 7 years. Every insult, every look, every moment of hidden observation. She saw the way his eyes dropped to her mouth, the pupils blowing wide until they nearly swallowed the grey. But just as he began to lean in, just as the gravity of their shared isolation threatened to pull them into something irrevocable, the window behind them shattered. A stray curse, a rogue streak of purple light slammed into the glass. Shards rained down like diamonds, glittering in the orange glow of the fires. Hermione threw herself over Draco, shielding his body with hers as the glass peppered her back. He reacted instantly, his seeker reflexes overriding his exhaustion. He rolled them over, pinning her beneath him against the stone floor, his body acting as a shield against the incoming debris. They lay there, breathless, the cold night air rushing through the broken window. Hermione's hands were pressed against his chest. His arms were braced on either side of her head. The proximity was absolute. She could feel the heat of his skin through his shirt, the sharp line of his hip bones, the desperation in his gaze. "Are you hurt?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "No," she breathed. "You?" He didn't answer. He was staring at her, as if he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, without the filter of pure-blood dogma or wartime fear. His eyes were dark with an emotion so intense it felt like a physical weight on her chest. "You're a nightmare, Hermione Granger," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, agonizing longing. "You're a beautiful, impossible nightmare." He began to lower his head, his lips a breath away from hers, when a scream echoed from the corridor outside. Not a snatcher, not a Death Eater. "Hermione! Hermione! Where are you?" Ron's voice. The sound was like a bucket of ice water. Draco recoiled as if he had been struck. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden biting cold. He scrambled to his feet, his face resetting into a mask of jagged stone. The repulsion was back, but this time it was directed inward. "Go," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Your night is calling. The war needs its brightest witch." "Draco, wait! Go!" he snapped, turning his back to her, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Before I remind myself why I'm supposed to hate you." Hermione stood up, her heart feeling as though it had been physically bruised. She looked at the silhouette of the boy she had almost kissed, the boy who was currently trying to push her back into the safety of her own world by being cruel. "I'm not leaving you, because he's calling," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm leaving because I have to finish this, so there's a world for you to live in. Don't you dare die while I'm gone." She didn't wait for an answer. She ran to the door, her eyes blurred with tears. As she stepped out into the corridor and saw Ron's frantic face at the end of the hall, she felt a part of herself remain behind in that dusty, broken classroom. The seesaw had swung one last time for the night, leaving her in the cold, but with the burning memory of his thumb against her pulse. "I need to know what's next," she thought, as she gripped her wand and ran toward the fire. "I have to see the dawn." The corridor was a blurred tunnel of smoke and screaming portraits. Hermione ran, her lungs burning, her mind still tethered to the cold stone floor of the classroom and the ghost of Draco's pulse beneath her thumb. She found Ron near the moving staircases, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide with a frantic relief that made her stomach twist with guilt. He grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shelter of a recessed archway as a section of the ceiling collapsed nearby. "Where were you?" he shouted over the roar of a distant explosion. "Harry's headed for the room of requirement. We've got to go, Hermione. We're running out of time." She nodded, her voice lost in the thunder of the battle, but as she followed him, her head kept turning back. Back toward the shadows, where a boy with silver blonde hair was waiting for the end of the world. She felt like a person divided, her body moving toward the noble end, her soul anchored in the grey twilight of an enemy's despair. The hours that followed were a descent into a waking nightmare. The fiend fire in the room of requirement, the heat of it, the roar of the living flames, felt like the physical manifestation of the turmoil in her chest. When she saw Draco again, he was clinging to the top of a mountain of charred furniture, his face contorted in a mask of pure, primal terror as the fire serpents snapped at his heels. Harry had steered the broom toward him. Hermione had watched, her heart stopping as Draco's hand reached out, desperate and clawing, to grab hold of his rival. In that moment, the enemy's labels were incinerated. There was only the clawing need to live. When they crashed onto the floor outside the room, coughing and covered in ash, Draco had scrambled away into the smoke without a word, without a look. He had vanished into the chaos like a ghost retreating from the light. Now the world had gone still. Voldemort's voice had echoed through the grounds, granting an hour of respite to dispose of the dead with dignity. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. It was the silence of the aftermath, heavy with the scent of blood and crushed lilies. Hermione stood on the edge of the great hall, her eyes scanning the rows of bodies. She saw the Weasleys huddled in a circle of grief that she felt she had no right to enter. She saw the pale, lifeless face of Fred, and her knees nearly buckled. The cost was too high. The brightest witch of her age couldn't think of a single spell to reverse the stillness of her heart. She felt a suffocating need for air. She turned away from the hall, walking with wooden legs back toward the upper floors. She didn't think. She let her feet lead her. She was a moth drawn back to a dying flame. The classroom was unrecognizable. The windows were entirely gone now, leaving the room open to the biting wind and the orange glow of the burning forest. Dust had settled over everything like a layer of grey snow. He was there. Draco was sitting in the same spot, leaning against the same cabinet. He looked like a statue carved from ash. His suit was torn, his face was smeared with soot and blood, and his eyes were fixed on a point in the air that didn't exist. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't flinch at the sound of the door. "You're alive," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Is he?" Draco asked, his voice a hollow rasp. He didn't need to name him. "Harry went into the forest," she said, her voice trembling. He's gone, Draco." The news seemed to hit him like a physical blow, but there was no outward movement, only a further hollowness in his expression. "Then it's over. The light goes out." Hermione walked toward him, her movements slow and heavy. The seesaw had stopped swinging. It had simply broken. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt, only a shared, devastating grief for a world that had failed them both. She sank onto the floor beside him, their shoulders brushing. The contact was cold, the fabric of their clothes rough and dirty, but it was the only real thing left. "He did it for us," she said, tears finally spilling over and carving tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "All of us." Draco let out a jagged, broken sound, a laugh that was more of a sob. "For me? He died for the boy who tried to kill his mentor. He died for the coward who couldn't even pick a side." He finally turned his head to look at her, and the raw agony in his eyes was unbearable. "I don't want his sacrifice, Hermione. I don't want to be the one who survived while everyone better than me burned." "You don't get to choose who dies," she said, reaching out and taking his hand. His fingers were limp at first, but then they convulsed, gripping hers with a strength that was almost painful. He held onto her hand as if it were a life raft in a dark ocean. "I'm so tired," he whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against her shoulder. "I just want it to stop. The noise in my head, the fear. I want to go to sleep and never wake up to see the morning he bought for me." Hermione leaned her head against his, her hair tangling with his. In the silence of the room, they listened to the wind whistling through the jagged remains of the window. The intimacy was no longer charged with the electricity of the chase. It was the quiet, desperate intimacy of the end. "You have to wake up," she murmured, "because if you don't, then everything he did, everything we've lost, it's for nothing. You have to be the person who was worth saving." Draco pulled back slightly, his face inches from hers. The orange light from the fires outside danced in the grey of his eyes, making them look like molten silver. "How can I be that? Look at me. I'm a traitor to my own blood and a parasite to yours." "You're Draco," she said, her hand moving to cup his cheek. Her thumb brushed over a small cut on his temple. "Just Draco, and that has to be enough." The tension shifted. The grief was still there, a heavy blanket over them, but beneath it, a different kind of desperation began to stir. It was the warmth returning, but this time it was tempered with the knowledge of mortality. They were 18, and they were surrounded by the dead, and the only heat in the world was the person sitting next to them. Draco's gaze dropped to her lips. His breathing hitched, the rhythm irregular and pained. "I should hate you," he whispered. "It would be so much easier if I still hated you." "Then do it," she challenged, her voice a breathy thread. "Hate me." "I can't," he groaned, his hand rising to tangle in the curls at the nape of her neck. He pulled her closer, his touch no longer hesitant. "I've spent years trying to drown the thought of you, and tonight, it's the only thing keeping me conscious." The approach was slow, agonizingly so. Every inch the distance closed felt like a mile of history being traversed. The air between them was thick with the scent of smoke, herbs, and the metallic tang of the war. He leaned in, his nose brushing hers, his eyes searching hers for one last reason to stop. He saw only the same hunger, the same need for a moment of peace in the center of the storm. His lips touched hers. It wasn't a kiss from a fairy tale. It was a collision. It tasted of salt, dust, and the bitterness of the calming draught. It was desperate, a frantic attempt to prove they were still alive, still capable of feeling something other than terror. Draco's hand gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, as if he were trying to merge their bodies into one singular, unbreakable unit. Hermione let out a small, broken sob into his mouth. her arms winding around his neck, her fingers digging into the fine, soft hair at his scalp. In this small, ruined corner of the world, the war didn't matter. The blood didn't matter. There was only the heat of his mouth, the pressure of his body, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that she had found a home in the heart of her enemy. But the kiss was fueled by despair, and when they pulled apart, the cold rushed back in. Draco stared at her, his lips red and swollen, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked at her as if he had just committed a final, irreversible sin. "The hour is almost up," he whispered, his voice trembling. He stood up, pulling her with him, but as soon as they were on their feet, he released her. The cold was settling in again, the realization of what lay beyond the door. "If he's really gone," Draco said, his voice regaining a sliver of that jagged Malfoy steel, "then the next time I see you, I'll be standing behind my father, and you'll be standing with the dead." "No," Hermione said, reaching for him. "Don't," he snapped, backing away toward the door. "This was a dream, Hermione. The last dream before the nightmare starts again." He turned and vanished into the corridor, leaving her alone in the dust. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer a curiosity. It was a physical ache. She stood in the center of the room, the taste of him still on her tongue, watching the dawn begin to break over the horizon, a dawn that promised only blood. The dawn did not bring light. It brought a sickly, grey haze that smelled of extinction. Hermione moved through the ruins of the entrance hall like a ghost. Her body was a map of aches, bruises from falling masonry, the stinging heat of minor hexes, and the deep, hollow throb in her chest where her heart used to be. The temporary ceasefire had ended, not with a whimper, but with the bone-chilling procession from the forbidden forest. She had stood among the survivors, clutching Ginny's hand so hard her knuckles turned white as Hagrid emerged from the trees carrying the limp form of Harry Potter. In that moment of absolute despair, when the Dark Lord's laughter echoed like breaking glass against the stones of the castle, Hermione's eyes hadn't been on Voldemort. They had been searching the ranks of the Death Eaters. She found him. Draco was standing between his parents, a thin, black-clad figure that looked ready to shatter at the slightest touch of the wind. Narcissa's hand was a vice on his arm, and Lucius looked like a man already dead. But Draco was staring at the spot where Hermione stood. Even across the distance of the courtyard, across the chasm of blood and betrayal, his gaze was an anchor. It was the cold of the morning, the harsh reality of their separate worlds, yet his eyes held the shadow of the kiss they had shared in the dust. Then the world shifted. Neville stood forth. Harry fell from Hagrid's arms, alive. The cry that went up from the defenders was a primal roar, a surge of hope so violent it shook the very foundations of the earth. In the ensuing explosion of violence, as the battle spilled back into the Great Hall, the Malfoys were swept away in the tide of retreating shadows. Hermione was caught in the fray, a whirlwind of shield charms and stunning spells, her mind a frantic calculation of Horcruxes and survival. She saw Bellatrix fall. She saw the Dark Lord's fury. And then, amidst the screaming chaos, she saw a flash of silver-blonde hair disappearing through a side door leading toward the dungeons. She didn't think. She didn't check for Ron or Harry. She turned and ran. The descent into the lower levels was like diving into a cold, dark lake. The sounds of the battle became muffled, a rhythmic thumping like the heartbeat of a dying giant. The air here was damp, smelling of salt and ancient enchantments. She found him in a narrow passageway near the potions classroom, cornered by two snatchers who had survived the initial breach and were looking for easy prey, or a way out. "Look at this," one of them sneered, a filthy man with yellow teeth. "The Malfoy whelp. Think you can just slip away while your master's losing? Your daddy's name won't save you now." Draco's wand was raised, but his arm was shaking. The emotional seesaw of the night had left him physically and magically bankrupt. He looked like a cornered animal, beautiful and doomed. "Expelliarmus!" The spell burst from Hermione's wand with the force of a thunderclap. The first snatcher's wand flew into the darkness, and the second man barely had time to turn before a stupefy caught him square in the chest. They fell like sacks of flour, leaving the corridor in a ringing, heavy silence. Draco slumped against the stone wall, his wand slipping from his numb fingers. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The approach this time was slow, weighted with the exhaustion of 1,000 lifetimes. "You're a fool," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You should be up there, celebrating, taking your place as the heroine." "I told you," Hermione said, her voice trembling as she stepped toward him. "I wasn't leaving you." She stopped just inches away. The tension between them was no longer about the war outside. The Dark Lord was being dismantled floor by floor, soul by soul. The tension now was the terrifying, what happens next? The trust they had built in the dark was now being tested by the light of a world that would soon demand an accounting. "My parents," Draco said, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "They're looking for a way out, to the grounds. We have to go, Hermione. If we stay, the Ministry, the Wizengamot, they'll put me in a cage." "Come with me," she urged, her hand reaching out but stopping short of his chest. "I can speak for you. Harry will speak for you. You didn't kill him. You helped us." "I helped because I was afraid," he shouted, the sound echoing off the low ceiling. "I helped because I'm a coward who wanted to live. Don't make it something noble. It wasn't noble." "It was human," she countered. She closed the distance, her hand finally landing on his arm. Through the dark fabric of his sleeve, she felt the rigid tension of his muscles. The warmth was a desperate, flickering thing. She looked at his face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the haunting grey of his eyes, and felt a wave of protective fury. She wouldn't let the world take him, not after she had found the boy beneath the mask. Draco looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The repulsion he usually used as a shield was gone, leaving him completely exposed. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her throat, hovering just above the scar he knew was hidden by her collar. "I can't be what you want," he whispered, his thumb grazing her chin. "I'm stained, Hermione. I'm a Malfoy. That name means something in your world now, and it's not something you want near you." "Let me decide what I want," she breathed. The internal monologue that usually governed her, the logic, the rules, the foresight, fell silent. There was only the sensation of his skin against hers, the smell of wood smoke and winter that still clung to him despite the fire. She saw the doubt in his eyes, the belief that he was unworthy, and she wanted to burn it out of him. She moved first. She stood on her tiptoes, her hands sliding up to cup his face. His skin was cold, but his breath was hot against her lips. "Stay," she whispered. Draco let out a broken, jagged sound, a surrender. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground, crushing her against him as if he were trying to draw the very life from her lungs. This wasn't the desperate survival kiss of the classroom. This was a claim. It was an admission of a need so deep it terrified them both. He kissed her with a ferocity that spoke of years of suppressed longing, of every mudblood he had shouted to, hide the fact that he couldn't stop watching her in the library, of every sneer he had used to mask his admiration for her brilliance. It was a kiss of fire and ice, a collision of their past and a desperate, uncertain future. Hermione's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, her body moulding to his. In the damp, dark corridor of the dungeons, they created a world that consisted only of their intertwined heartbeats. The emotional seesaw hit its peak, a moment of pure, unadulterated approach that ignored the fact that outside the world was being reborn in blood. But then, a distant, earth-shaking roar reached them. A cheer. 1,000 voices rising in a single, triumphant cry. The Dark Lord was dead. The silence that followed the cheer was the loudest sound Hermione had ever heard. It was the sound of the end, and the sound of the beginning. Draco pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were wet, his expression one of profound, agonizing fear. The cold of reality rushed back in, sharper than ever. "It's over," he whispered. "Yes," she said, her heart breaking for the look of terror on his face. "It's over." "They'll come for me now," he said, his hands dropping from her waist. He looked toward the exit, toward the light and the noise of the victors. "The dream is finished, Hermione." He looked at her one last time, a look of such intense, hopeless love that it made her gasp. Then he did the only thing he knew how to do to protect her. He backed away. "Go to them," he said, his voice cracking. "Be their queen. I'll be what I've always been, a shadow." He turned and ran, not toward the great hall, but deeper into the darkness of the dungeons, toward the secret paths that led out to the lake. "Draco!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the stone. She stood alone in the corridor, the taste of him still on her lips, the "I need to know what's next." Now a terrifying, looming question. She had to choose, the light of the victory or the boy in the dark. The morning sun was a cruel intruder. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an exposure. The golden light spilled over the jagged edges of the broken battlements, illuminating the true extent of the devastation. Hermione stood at the mouth of the dungeon stairs, her lungs burning from the damp, stagnant air she had just fled. Behind her lay the darkness where Draco had vanished. Before her lay the great hall, a cavern of grief and triumph. She was a girl caught between two deaths. The death of the girl she used to be, who followed every rule and believed in clear lines of black and white, and the death of the world she had promised to save. She moved toward the great hall, her feet dragging through the dust. Every step was a betrayal. She saw Harry and Ron standing by the fountain in the courtyard, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. They looked like statues of heroes, weathered and cracked, but still standing. When they saw her, the relief that flooded their faces was so pure it made her want to weep with shame. "Hermione!" Ron called out, his voice hoarse. He ran to her, pulling her into a crushing hug. He smelled of salt and adrenaline. "We thought, where did you go? We lost you after the surge. I got turned around in the chaos, she whispered into his shoulder, the lie tasting like ash. The corridors were collapsing. Harry stepped forward, his green eyes weary but perceptive. He looked at her, really looked at her, noticing the way her hand trembled, the way her eyes kept darting back toward the shadows of the castle. He didn't ask, but she saw the flicker of understanding. He knew she was carrying a secret that didn't belong to the Golden Trio. The emotional seesaw was now a violent internal thing. Being with them was warmth, the safety of the familiar, the comfort of the family she had chosen. But it felt cold, because it was a world where Draco Malfoy did not exist, except as a name on a list of the accused. She felt the repulsion again, but this time it was directed at her own luck. Why did she get the sun while he was forced into the holes in the earth? The ministry is already here, Harry said quietly, gesturing toward the figures in plum-coloured robes moving through the hall. Kingsley is taking charge, but the Dementors are being recalled. They're rounding up everyone with a mark, anyone who didn't fall. Hermione's heart stopped, rounding them up. She looked at her friends, the brothers of her soul, and for the first time she felt a chasm open between them. They were looking for peace. She was looking for a ghost. "I need to find someone," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "Who?" Ron asked, his brow furrowing. "Hermione. The healers are overwhelmed. They said—" "I have to go," she insisted, backing away. "I'll meet you at the burrow, I promise, but I have to do this alone." She didn't wait for them to argue. She turned and ran, not toward the hall, but toward the lake. If Draco was looking for a way out, he would go to the water. The Slytherin common room was beneath the lake. Its depths were his only home. The grounds were a graveyard of giants and stone. She ran past the smoking remains of the Quidditch pitch, her eyes scanning the shoreline. The air was cold, the mist rising off the black water like a shroud. She found him near the boathouse, the very place where Snape had bled out. Draco was standing on the narrow wooden pier, his back to the castle. His parents were a few yards away, speaking in frantic, hushed tones to a group of ministry officials who had intercepted them. They were being detained, their wands confiscated. But Draco was standing apart, his hands empty, staring at the horizon where the sun was struggling to burn through the fog. He looked so small against the vastness of the lake. The tension between them was now stretched across the open air, a thin, vibrating wire. She approached him slowly. The grass was wet under her boots. One of the ministry wizards started to move toward her, but she raised her hand, the hand that held the wand that had helped win the war, and he stopped, recognizing her. The brightest witch had her uses, even now. "Draco," she breathed. He didn't turn around. His shoulders didn't even move. "You shouldn't have come here, Hermione. They're watching. You'll be seen with a Death Eater." "I'm seen with a boy I know," she said, stepping onto the wooden planks of the pier. The wood groaned under her weight. "A boy who saved my life in the fire. A boy who didn't tell his aunt who I was when I was on his floor. A boy who stood by and watched," Draco countered, his voice flat. He finally turned, and the sight of him in the full light of day was even more haunting than in the dark. The sun highlighted the sharp skeletal hollows of his face. "Go back to your parade. Go back to the life you earned." "I don't want a life that doesn't have the truth in it," she said, stopping just a foot away. The seesaw tipped toward a desperate, agonizing approach. She reached out and took his hand. It was limp and cold, like a fallen leaf. She interlaced her fingers with his, forcing him to feel her warmth, forcing him to remain anchored to the earth. "They're going to take you, aren't they?" she whispered. "Azkaban, probably," he said, a ghost of a sneer flickering on his lips, though his eyes were wet. Though without the Dementors, it might just be a very cold, very lonely cell. I suppose I should thank Potter for that. "No," Hermione said, her voice fierce. "I won't let them. I have the memories, Draco. I'll give them to the Wizengamot. I'll show them the night in the classroom. I'll show them the panic. I'll show them that you were a victim too." Draco let out a harsh, broken laugh. "A victim? I'm a Malfoy. I was a Prince of the Dark. No one wants to hear that the prince was just a scared child. They want someone to pay for the blood on the floor, and I'm a very convenient currency." He pulled his hand away, but she grabbed his lapel, shaking him. The conflict between them flared, his desire to disappear versus her refusal to let him. "Look at me," she commanded. "You don't get to decide you're a monster just because it's easier than being human. You kissed me, Draco. You held me while the world was ending. Do you think I'd do that for a monster? Do you think I'm that easily fooled? I think you're a girl who wants to save everything," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "And some things are just broken, Hermione. Some things are just meant to be discarded." "Then I'm broken too," she shouted back. "Because I can't breathe without wondering where you are. Because I can't look at the sun without seeing your hair. Because I love you, you idiot." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the waves of the lake seemed to stop their lapping against the wood. The word hung in the air, golden and terrifying. It was the ultimate betrayal of their roles. The mudblood loved the Death Eater. The war was over, and the world was supposed to be simple, but they had made it impossible. Draco's eyes widened, the grey turning to a stormy, turbulent sea. His mask didn't just crack, it shattered, falling away to reveal a depth of longing so profound it was almost grotesque. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't believe in. "You can't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You can't say that." "I just did," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The warmth surged back, a tidal wave of it. Draco reached out, his hands trembling as they gripped her shoulders. He pulled her toward him, his forehead crashing against hers. He was shaking, truly shaking now, a violent tremor that came from the very core of his being. "I've loved you since the 3rd year," he confessed, the words pouring out of him like a confession of a crime. "I've hated myself for it every single day. I've tried to kill it, to bury it under the pureblood rot. But you were always there. The smartest, the bravest, the only thing in this world that made sense." He kissed her then, and it was different from all the others. There was no desperation of death, no fear of the dark. It was a kiss of agonizing, beautiful truth. It was the final shift beginning, the realization that they weren't just survivors, they were a destination, but the cold was still waiting. "Malfoy, step away from the girl!" A squad of Aurors was approaching the pier, their wands levelled. Narcissa was being led away, her head bowed. The reality of the world was closing in. Draco pulled back, his eyes searching hers one last time. He looked terrified, but for the first time, he didn't look hopeless. Stay, she whispered, clutching his hand. I have to go, he said, his voice steady for the first time. But I'll come back. If you're still there, if you're still waiting. I'll be there, she promised, tears blurring her vision. I'll be there at every trial. I'll be there at every gate. You aren't going back to the dark, Draco. I won't let you. The auras reached the pier. They pulled them apart, their hands rough. Draco didn't fight. He kept his eyes on her as they led him away toward the castle, toward the cells, toward the long, hard road to redemption. Hermione stood on the pier, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She felt the "I need to know what's next" settle into a quiet, resolute flame in her chest. The battle for the world was won. Now the battle for the boy began. The ministry cells were located in the lowest levels of the castle, far beneath the joyous reunions and the clatter of restorative magic. Down here, the walls were slick with ancient damp, and the only sound was the rhythmic drip of water and the distant, muffled echo of the world being rebuilt. Hermione sat on a cold stone bench outside the heavy iron bars of the final holding cell, her hands folded in her lap. She had refused to leave. She had ignored Harry's concerned glances and Ron's confused silence. She had simply walked down into the dark and waited. The silence between her and the boy behind the bars was not the silence of enemies anymore. It was the silence of two people who had survived a shipwreck and were now standing on a shore they didn't recognize. Draco was sitting on the floor of his cell, his back against the cold iron. He had been stripped of his outer robes, leaving him in a thin white shirt that made him look painfully young and fragile. The silver blonde hair was dull, and the shadows under his eyes had deepened into bruises. He looked like a ghost waiting for a summons. "You're still here," he said, his voice a dry rasp that broke the quiet. He didn't look at her. "I told you I would be," Hermione replied. Her voice was steady, anchored by a resolve that had only hardened during the hours of waiting. "They're taking us to London at dawn," Draco whispered. "My father, my mother, and me. The trials start in a week. They won't let you in, Hermione. They won't let the war heroine sit in the gallery for a Malfoy." "Then I'll stand outside the doors," she said, leaning her head against the bars. "And then I'll walk inside and testify. I've already spoken to Kingsley. He's the interim minister now. He knows about the manor. He knows you didn't identify us." Draco finally turned his head. His eyes were wide and filled with a frantic, desperate sort of hope that he seemed to be trying to crush. "It won't be enough. The public, they need a scapegoat. They need to see the snake's head on a pike." "You are not your father's sins, Draco," she said, reaching through the bars. Her fingers brushed the fabric of his sleeve. For a moment, he hesitated, the old repulsion of his upbringing warring with the warmth of the girl who had changed everything. Then he moved. He crawled toward the bars and pressed his face against the cold metal, reaching through to grab her hand. His grip was bruising. It was the touch of a drowning man. "I don't know how to be the person you see," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to live in a world where I'm not hated." "You start by letting me love you," she whispered. "The rest we'll figure out as we go." The emotional seesaw hit its final stable equilibrium. The approach was no longer a frantic survival tactic. It was a promise. Draco pulled her hand toward his face, pressing his lips to her knuckles, then to her palm. His tears were hot against her skin, the first real tears of relief he had allowed himself in years. "I'm terrified," he breathed against her hand. "Me too," she admitted. "But for the first time, I'm not afraid of the ending. I'm just afraid of how long it will take to get to the beginning." The hours ticked by in a blur of shared whispers and the slow, inevitable creep of the morning. They talked about things they had never dared to mention. The way he had watched her in the library during their 4th year. The way she had felt a strange, inexplicable pang of sympathy when she saw him looking pale at the start of 6th. They spoke of the dust in the classroom and the taste of the salt on the pier. They mapped out the geography of their shared trauma, turning the scars into landmarks of a new, shared history. As the first grey light of the true morning began to filter down the stairwell, the sound of heavy boots echoed from above. Their auras were coming. Draco stood up, pulling her with him as far as the bars would allow. The cold of reality was back, but this time it was tempered by the heat of her hand in his. He looked at her, and the mask was entirely gone. In its place was a man who was ready to face the consequences, because he knew what was waiting for him on the other side. "Hermione," he said, his voice low and intense. If the sentence is long, you can't wait. You have to live. You have to be the witch the world needs." "Don't you dare give me an out," she snapped, her eyes flashing with her old fire. "I've spent 7 years fighting for a world I believed in. I'm not going to stop fighting now that I've found the person I want to live in it with." The cell door creaked open. 2 auras stepped inside, their faces grim and professional. They didn't use magic. They used heavy iron manacles. Draco didn't flinch as they clicked around his wrists. He kept his eyes locked on hers. "Time to go, Malfoy," one of them said, not unkindly. Draco stepped out of the cell. For a brief, stolen second, the auras allowed them a moment. Draco surged forward, his hands restricted by the chain, and captured her lips in a kiss that was a vow. It tasted of the end of the world and the birth of a new one. It was a kiss of fire, of redemption, and of an impossible, defiant love. "I'll see you at the ministry," she whispered against his mouth. "I'll be looking for you," he promised. They led him away. Hermione stood in the damp corridor, watching his receding figure until he disappeared around the curve of the stone stairs. She was alone again in the dark, but the dark no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the womb of the future. She walked out of the dungeons and into the great hall. The sun was fully up now, a brilliant, blinding gold that washed over the ruins of Hogwarts. She saw Harry and Ron waiting for her by the entrance, their faces weary but welcoming. They didn't ask where she had been. They just opened the circle and let her in. "Is it over?" Ron asked, looking out at the smoking grounds. Hermione looked at the spot where the pier met the lake, then up at the tower where a boy had once been told he had no choice. She felt the weight of the mudblood scar and the memory of the silver blonde hair. "No," she said, a small, sad, but hopeful smile touching her lips. "The war is over, but the story is just beginning." She stepped out into the light, her heart full of the ghost of a boy and the promise of a dawn that belonged to them both. The last night before the battle had ended, and for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger wasn't looking for a plan. She was just looking forward. The carriage that carried the Malfoys away from the castle was a black streak against the green of the hills. Inside, Draco Malfoy sat with his eyes closed, his thumb tracing the palm of his hand where the warmth of Hermione's touch still lingered. He didn't know what the Wizengamot would decide. He didn't know if he would ever see the sun without bars in front of it again. But as the carriage crested the hill and the ruins of Hogwarts vanished from sight, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer a shadow. He was a man who had been kissed by the light. And in the heart of the brightest witch of her age, the enemy had finally found his home. The Ministry of Magic did not smell of ancient stone and ozone like Hogwarts. It smelled of damp earth, cold ink, and the sterile, suffocating scent of bureaucracy. Deep in the subterranean levels, where the light of the sun was a forgotten myth, the holding cells hummed with a low, magical vibration designed to suppress the will of those trapped within. Hermione Granger sat on a hard wooden bench in the corridor of level 10. She had been there for 6 hours. Her back ached. Her hair was a chaotic nest of curls, and the mudblood scar on her arm felt like it was pulsing in the chill. She ignored the stares of the aurors passing by. She ignored the whispers of the clerks who couldn't understand why the Golden Girl was spending her first days of peace in the bowels of the Ministry. The emotional seesaw of the post-war world was brutal. Outside, people were dancing in the streets of Diagon Alley. Inside these walls, the air was thick with the settling dust of vengeance. "You have 10 minutes, Miss Granger," a guard grunted, his keys rattling like dry bones. "No wands, no physical contact through the bars." Hermione stood up, her legs stiff. She didn't correct him about the wands. She simply walked toward the iron door at the end of the hall. When it swung open, the silence of the cell block hit her like a physical weight. Draco Malfoy was sitting on a narrow cot in the far corner of the last cell. He looked smaller than he had at the lake. The Ministry-issued grey tunic was too thin for his frame, and the lack of sunlight had turned his skin the colour of milk. He didn't look up when she approached. He looked like a man who had already accepted his disappearance from the world. "Draco," she whispered. The name felt like a spark of fire in the cold room. He flinched. His eyes, dark and haunted, slowly rose to meet hers. The repulsion she expected wasn't there. Instead, there was a devastating, hollow exhaustion. "Go away, Hermione," he rasped. His voice was cracked, unused to anything but the silence of his own thoughts. "The trials start in 2 days. You shouldn't be here. Every minute you spend outside this cell is a minute you lose your status as a hero." "I don't care about the status," she said, stepping closer until her chest was almost touching the bars. "I care about the truth. I've brought you something." She pulled a small, battered book from her pocket, a collection of Muggle poetry she had kept in her beaded bag. She slid it through the gap in the bars. It thudded softly on the stone floor. Draco stared at it as if it were a poisonous snake. "Muggle ink? You really are trying to get me executed, aren't you?" "It's just words, Draco," she said, her voice softening. "Words that help when the dark gets too loud." The tension in the cell was thick. It was the "can't stand it" verses. Can't help but think dynamic they had lived with for years, now stripped of the war's urgency. Draco stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He walked toward the bars, stopping just inches from her. Up close, The warmth of their connection was undeniable. Despite the iron and the spells between them, the magnetic pull was so strong it made Hermione's breath catch. She could see the fine tremor in his hands, the same tremor she had calmed in the classroom. "Why?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Why do you keep coming back to a sinking ship? My father is going to the Dementors. My mother is under house arrest. I am a Malfoy, Hermione. I am the shadow in your bright new world. Why won't you let me just fade out?" "Because I remember the kiss," she whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "I remember the boy who was terrified. I remember the person you are when the mask is off. And that person is worth fighting for." Draco's expression fractured. The cold he was trying so hard to maintain shattered, revealing a raw, bleeding vulnerability. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he gripped the bars. "I have nothing to give you," he choked out. "No name, no fortune, no future. Just a mark that won't stop itching and a soul that's half gone." "I don't want your fortune," Hermione said. She reached through the bars, defying the guard's orders. She cupped his face, her warm skin meeting his ice-cold cheek. "I want the boy who stood with me in the dust. I want the man who decided he'd rather be a coward than a killer." The touch was electric. Draco let out a jagged, broken sound and leaned into her palm, his eyes closing as he surrendered to the contact. For a moment, the ministry cell vanished. They were back in the silence before the storm, two hearts finding a rhythm in the chaos. "I dreamed of you last night," he confessed, his voice a ghost of a sound. "In the dream, there were no wars, no blood. We were just at a library, and you were annoyed because I was leaning over your shoulder." Hermione let out a small, watery laugh. "I probably was." "It was the best dream I've ever had," he whispered. But the seesaw tipped toward betrayal as the heavy door at the end of the hall opened. Kingsley Shacklebolt walked in, his expression grim. Behind him stood two auras. "Miss Granger," Kingsley said, his voice echoing. "You need to leave. The Wizengamot has moved the preliminary hearing. They are taking Malfoy to the high-security wing for questioning." The cold rushed back in. Draco pulled away from her hand so abruptly it felt like a slap. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the jagged defensive walls of a prisoner. "See?" he said, a bitter, hollow smile touching his lips. "The world is calling you, Hermione, and it's calling for my head. Go. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she cried as the auras entered the cell. They grabbed Draco, their movements rough. He didn't fight them. He kept his eyes on Hermione as they forced his hands into heavy, magically dampening manacles. "I'll be there, Draco," she shouted over the noise of the chains. "I'll be at the hearing. I'll tell them everything." Draco didn't answer. He was led away, his head bowed, a silver-blonde shadow caught in the machinery of justice. Hermione stood in the empty cell block, her hand still tingling where she had touched his face. The internal monologue of her life was screaming at her to be logical, to be safe, to let the past bury its dead. But the fear she felt wasn't for her reputation. It was for the boy who had just told her about his library dream. She looked down at the floor. He hadn't picked up the book. She reached through the bars, retrieved the poetry collection, and held it to her chest. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer a question of romance. It was a question of survival. She walked out of level 10, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing. The war might have been over for everyone else, but for Hermione Granger, the most important battle was just beginning. The sun was setting over London as she emerged from the ministry, but she didn't see the colours. She only saw the grey of his eyes and the cold iron of the bars. She had 48 hours to save his life, and she wouldn't sleep until it was done. The air in courtroom 10 was thick enough to choke on. It was a cold, subterranean chamber, a place of jagged stone and high, judgmental benches that loomed like the cliffs of a dark ocean. Hermione sat in the front row of the witness gallery, her fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles were white. The emotional seesaw of the morning had been a dizzying ascent into terror. She had spent the dawn hours reviewing her memories, the silver threads of her past shimmering in a pensive, and now the reality of the present was a hammer blow. When the heavy doors groaned open, a hush fell over the crowd. Draco Malfoy was led in, not by auras this time, but by the weight of his own history. He was chained to the witness chair, the iron rattling against the stone. He looked gaunt, the light from the overhead magical orbs casting skeletal shadows across his face. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the minister. He looked at the floor, his posture one of a man who had already accepted the executioner's kiss. "The Wizengamot will come to order," Kingsley Shacklebolt's voice boomed, resonant and weary. "We are here to determine the culpability of Draco Lucius Malfoy in the crimes of conspiracy, attempted murder, and service to the Dark Lord." The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Hilliard, began a relentless assault. He spoke of the vanishing cabinet, the cursed necklace, and the night on the astronomy tower. Every word was a stone thrown at a glass house. Hermione watched Draco flinch with every sentence, his eyes closing as if he were reliving the horrors. The repulsion in the room was palpable. The gallery was filled with people who had lost brothers, sisters, and children. They didn't see a boy. They saw a snake that had let the wolves into the fold. "The prosecution calls its primary witness for the defense," Kingsley announced, his gaze shifting to Hermione. Hermione Jean Granger. A murmur rippled through the courtroom like a wind through dry leaves. The golden girl, the brightest witch, standing for a Malfoy. Hermione stood up. Her legs felt like water, but her heart was a steady, burning coal. As she walked to the center of the room, her eyes finally met Draco's. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The warmth was there, hidden beneath his terror. A flick of his gaze that pleaded with her to stop, to save herself, to let him burn. She ignored the plea. "I have submitted my memories for the court's review," Hermione began, her voice clear and carrying through the vaulted chamber. "But memories are only images. I am here to speak of the soul behind them." "Miss Granger," Hilliard interrupted, his tone patronizing. "We are not here for sentiment. We are here for justice. The defendant admits to his crimes. He admits to taking the mark." "He was 16 years old," Hermione fired back, the fire in her blood finally erupting. "He was a child given a choice between a murder he couldn't commit and the death of his mother. That is not a choice. That is a torture." She stepped closer to the prisoner's chair. The proximity was a violation of protocol, but no one moved to stop her. The tension in the room shifted from legalistic to rawly human. "I was at Malfoy Manor," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the room. She pulled back her sleeve, exposing the jagged white scar. The word mudblood seemed to glow in the dim light. I was on the floor of his drawing room. His aunt was carving this into my skin. Draco Malfoy stood 3 feet away. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Draco's head snapped up, his face twisted in an expression of pure, agonizing shame. He tried to pull his hands back, the chains clashing. He could have identified us, Hermione continued, her eyes locked on his. He knew Harry's face better than anyone. He knew Ron. He knew me. But he lied. He looked into our eyes, and he chose to be a coward in the eyes of his master, so he could be a savior in the eyes of the truth. He saved our lives that night, at the cost of his own soul's peace. The seesaw tipped violently toward trust. The fury in the gallery softened into a confused, heavy silence. Hermione turned back to the benches of the Wizengamot. If you punish the boy who was forced into the dark, you are telling every child in our world that there is no path back to the light. You are finishing the work that Voldemort started. She sat down. The silence that followed was longer than the war. Draco was staring at her, his lips trembling, his eyes filled with a gratitude so intense it was painful to witness. The can't help but think was no longer a secret. It was a public confession. The deliberation lasted for hours. Hermione waited in the corridor, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. Ron and Harry found her there. Ron looked at her with a complicated mix of sadness and respect. He didn't understand her love for Malfoy, but he understood her fight for justice. "He's not like his father, Hermione," Ron said quietly, leaning against the wall. "I saw him in the fire. He was just a kid who wanted to go home." When the bell finally rang, summoning them back, the air felt electric. "Draco Lucius Malfoy," Kingsley announced, the parchment trembling slightly in his hands. "For your actions in the final battle and in light of the testimony provided, you are cleared of the charges of murder. However, for your service to the Dark Lord, you are sentenced to 5 years of magical probation. Your wand will be monitored. You will be required to assist in the restoration of Hogwarts Castle. You are to be a shadow until you have earned your light." Draco didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He simply let out a long, shuddering breath and slumped in the chair. He was free. Not the freedom of the sun, but the freedom of a chance. As the guards began to unshackle him, Hermione moved. She didn't care about the cameras of the Daily Prophet or the stares of the ministry officials. She ran to him. He stood up, his legs shaking, and as the last chain fell away, he caught her. The approach was a collision. He buried his face in her hair, his hands clutching her back, as if she were the only thing keeping the earth from swallowing him whole. The internal monologue was silent now. There was only the sensation of his heart beating against hers, the rhythm steady and real. "Why?" he choked out into her curls. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you were worth saving," she whispered, her arms tightening around his neck. "And because I'm not finished with you yet." He pulled back, his hands cupping her face. The grey of his eyes was no longer stormy. It was clear, like the sky after a hurricane. In the middle of the Ministry of Magic, surrounded by the ghosts of their enemies and the judgment of their world, Draco Malfoy kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss that tasted of tears and the first breath of spring. It was the final shift. The enemies were gone. The lovers were all that remained. "I have to go back to the castle tomorrow," he said, his forehead resting against hers, "to start the work." "I know," she said, a small, fierce smile on her lips. "I'll be there. I still have a few books I need to return to the library." He laughed, a real, genuine sound that made her heart leap. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer a cliffhanger. It was a horizon. They walked out of the courtroom together, their fingers interlaced, leaving the shadows behind. The war was over. The trial was finished. And for Draco and Hermione, the dawn was finally, truly beginning. Hogwarts, in the wake of the war, was a skeleton of its former self, a grand, broken gargoyle staring out over the black waters of the lake. The towers were jagged teeth against a sky that had finally turned a soft, forgiving blue. The scent of wood smoke still lingered in the stones, but it was being slowly replaced by the sharp green smell of wet earth and budding gorse. Hermione Granger stood at the edge of the stone bridge, her boots crunching on the gravel. She had returned not as a student, but as a volunteer, a part of the restoration project sanctioned by the ministry. But she knew she was there for more than just the masonry. At the far end of the courtyard, near the collapsed remains of the clock tower, a group of figures moved in silence. They were the shadows, the ones on probation, the ones whose hands were marked, but whose hearts had been deemed salvageable. Among them, taller and paler than the rest, was Draco Malfoy. He was levitating a massive block of granite, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't wearing his fine robes anymore. He wore a simple, charcoal-coloured sweater and dark trousers, his sleeves pushed up to reveal his forearms. The dark mark was visible, a faded, ugly stain in the bright morning light, but he didn't try to hide it. He worked with a grim, relentless focus, as if by setting the stones straight, he could somehow realign the shattered pieces of his own life. The emotional seesaw today was quiet, a steady vibration of caution and longing. Hermione watched him for a long moment, the air between them thick with the memory of the courtroom kiss. Since the trial, they had spoken only through letters, short, clipped notes that hummed with the things they couldn't yet say. She began to walk toward him. Draco felt her presence before he saw her. He lowered the stone with a dull thud and turned, his grey eyes widening as they found her. The repulsion that usually guarded his face flickered for a second, the old fear that he was a blight on her reputation, but it was quickly swallowed by a raw, naked warmth. "Granger," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet courtyard. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of limestone dust. "Malfoy," she replied, stopping a few feet away. She didn't call him Draco here, not yet. The walls had ears, and the castle was still full of ghosts who remembered their names as battle cries. "I didn't think you'd be here so early," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate register. He stepped away from the other workers, drawing her into the shadow of a surviving archway. The ministry said the heroes weren't expected until the weekend. "I never was very good at following the schedule," Hermione said, her lips curving into a small, nervous smile. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dust on his sleeve. "How are you, Draco?" The use of his name made him exhale a long, shuddering breath. He looked around at the ruins, at the scars on the stone that mirrored the scars on their souls. "I'm tired. I'm hated," and I've never felt more alive. The tension between them was different now. It wasn't the frantic electric fear of the last night. It was a slow burn, a steady heat that spoke of a future they were building stone by stone. Draco reached out, his hand hesitating before he tucked a stray, wind-blown curl behind her ear. His touch was sandpaper and silk, a physical manifestation of his new reality. "They talk about us, you know," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "In the great hall, in the ministry. They say you've lost your mind. They say I've used some dark glamour on the brightest witch." "Let them talk," Hermione said, her chin lifting with that familiar, fierce defiance. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected. I've fought a war for the right to choose, and I choose this." This was the uncertainty. This was the boy who had once called her names and now looked at her as if she were the sun. The internal monologue that usually occupied Hermione's mind, the lists of chores, the research on laws, the worry for Harry and Ron, fell away. She stepped into his space, her hands sliding up his chest to rest on his shoulders. Under the wool of his sweater, his heart was beating a heavy rhythmic tattoo. "I brought you something," she murmured. She pulled the book of poetry from her bag, the one he had left in the cell. She held it out to him, her fingers lingering on the cover. "You forgot this." Draco took the book, his fingers brushing hers. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, the kind of smile he had never shared with anyone but her. "I didn't forget it, Hermione. I just didn't think I deserved to keep something so beautiful." "You do," she insisted. "Open it." He opened the book to the page she had marked. Inside, pressed between the leaves, was a single dried bluebell, the flower she had made for him in a jar of fire years ago to keep him warm during a cold winter. It was a symbol of her trust, a bridge between their shared childhood and their complicated adulthood. Draco stared at the flower, his eyes darkening with an emotion so intense it made Hermione's breath hitch. He closed the book and pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her waist with a strength that spoke of 1,000 unspoken promises. The approach was final. There was no more betrayal, no more doubt. There was only the weight of him against her and the taste of the spring air. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her temple. "I don't know if I can ever be the man you deserve," he whispered into her hair. "But I will spend every day of these 5 years trying." "Don't be the man I deserve," Hermione whispered back, pulling his head down to hers. "Just be the man who stays." The kiss that followed was the first stone of their new life. It was slow and deep, tasting of salt and limestone and the sweetness of a morning that didn't end in blood. In the center of the ruined courtyard, surrounded by the debris of their past, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger stopped being legends of a war and started being the architects of a peace. They pulled apart eventually, their foreheads resting together. The "I need to know what's next" was now a shared journey. "Back to work?" Draco asked, his voice light with a newfound hope. "Back to work," she agreed, taking his hand. They walked back toward the collapsed tower together, their fingers interlaced. A lion and a snake, a hero and a shadow, building a home from the ashes. The sun rose higher, bleaching the scars of the castle until they were just part of the architecture, a reminder that even the most broken things can be made whole again if you have the patience to fit the pieces back together.
Thank you for staying with me. This story is not just about war, it is about two broken people. Draco and Hermione lived in two different worlds. They were told to hate each other, but in the dark they found something real. Life is often like that. We build walls around our hearts. We judge people by their names or their past, but sometimes our enemy is just another person who is afraid. I wanted to show that love is a choice. It is a brave choice. Even when the world is falling apart, we can choose to be kind. We can choose to forgive. I hope this story touched your heart. I hope it reminded you that light can grow in the darkest places. Thank you for listening. Keep believing in magic and keep believing in love. Goodbye for now.